Hello, I'm Alicia Ng from The Trend is Blue, and today I'll be giving a presentation on China and carbon emissions, climate change. Let's first look at climate change. It is generally agreed that fossil fuels and industry are the main sources of carbon dioxide. Globally, total emissions from fossil fuels and cement increased in 2011 by 3%. That is less than the rise in 2010, but higher than the average annual increase for the past decade, which stands at 2.7%. This suggests that efforts to curb global emissions have so far failed to make any impact. The continued steep rise in global carbon emissions will make it even more difficult for the world's nations to fulfill their stated aim of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, considered a danger threshold after which the risks of irreversible climate change increase. So why does China matter? So in this context, why does China matter? China is the biggest emitter of fossil fuel-related emissions, and in 2006 became the largest emitter of carbon dioxide emissions alone. China thus directly contributed to the 3% increase in fossil fuel emissions in 2011 and half of the annual emissions growth. The increase in China's CO2 emissions was mainly due to a continued high economic growth rate, with related increases in fossil fuel consumption. For example, from 2000 to 2009, China's coal-dominated energy consumption increased at an annual rate of 9%, driven mainly by economic development, such as building construction and infrastructure. China's thirst for economic development may make curbing its demand for environmentally harmful resources difficult. China currently, for example, is the world's largest coal importer. The table pictured shows top-down estimates of China's total CO2 emissions from 2005 to 2010. A bottom-up estimate has also been made by a team of scientists from China, Britain, and the United States. The study covered two sets of energy data from China's National Bureau of Statistics, which points out that the top-down method has discrepancies between provincial level and national figures, and does not take sufficient account of the big differences in calorific content of China's many grades of coal. However, even if the findings are confirmed, these would not change the bigger picture. China pumps out more carbon than any other country, about 22% of the global total. Thus, China's CO2 emissions are of a central concern in efforts to combat global climate change. Provincial emissions 2005-2009. During 2005 to 2009, the emission growth rates of the coastal provinces are estimated to have been lower than those of the interior provinces, although the absolute emissions of the interior provinces were generally small in comparison. The largest absolute emissions are found in coastal provinces in east and north-central areas, including the provinces of Shandong, Jiangsu, and Hebei, relative to the size of their economies and their population densities. In 2005, East, North Central, and South Central China, covering only 35% of the country's territory, but containing 69% of the national population and responsible for 78% of Chinese GDP, are estimated to account for 73% of the national emissions of anthropogenic CO2. Per capita emissions in China increased by 9% in 2011 to reach 7.2 tons per person, only a fraction lower than the EU average of 7.5 tons. Compared to EU countries, China's per capita emissions was roughly equivalent to that of Portugal and Sweden. Comparative per capita emissions. In East Asia and Oceania, Brunei and Australia have the largest in the region of 27.54 and 18.57 thousand metric tons of CO2 respectively. China is the 11th largest emitter in this region. Comparative CO2 intensity. Comparative CO2 intensity, China and the EU 27. In terms of CO2 intensity, China is near the top by 2008 with Estonia, Cyprus, and Poland. This high level of emissions, based on fuel combusted, is mainly linked to industry and a coal-dominated fuel mix. To reduce China's dependence on coal, China is investing in and providing policy for renewables, efficiency targets, the CDM, and carbon trading and carbon tax. Renewables world. Regarding world renewables, the share of new renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind energy and biofuels, although still very small, is increasing with accelerated speed. From 1992 to 2004, world renewables doubled from a share of 0.5% to 1%. From 1992 to 2004, world renewables doubled from a share of 0.5% to 1%, and from 2005 to 2011 doubled again to 2.1% by 2011. This could potentially represent about 0.8 billion tons in avoided CO2 emissions in 2011 that would have been emitted from fossil fuel power generation and road transport. In 2006, China adopted a target for a 15% share of primary energy to come from renewables by 2020, up from 8% in 2006. This target has now been revised in two respects. The first is that the new target is for a 15% share of final energy consumption. This change puts China's target on the same accounting footing as the European Union, which adopted a target in 2008 for a 20% share of final energy by 2020. However, the second revision to the China target changed the scope from renewables to non-fossil fuel sources, which includes nuclear. Nuclear power currently provides less than a 0.3% share of final energy in China, but will increase by 2020. So the net impact on total renewables by 2020 of the target change is complicated to assess. The central government's current draft plan calls for a total of 500 gigawatts of renewable power capacity by 2020, 300 gigawatts of hydropower, 150 gigawatts of wind power, 30 gigawatts of biomass power, and 20 gigawatts of solar PV. This would be almost one-third of China's expected total power capacity of 1,600 gigawatts by 2020. Renewables and non-fossil fuel sources China currently implements as a power source are biomass, hydro, natural gas, nuclear, solar, wind, and wave. And thanks to national programs such as the Golden Sun program, which subsidizes pilot projects for solar power generation, the nation's installed solar power capacity grew more than 300% from 2010 to 2011 to reach about 3 gigawatts. Installed wind power generating capacity reached 62 gigawatts in 2010, but installed capacity does not mean actual use. Unfortunately, certain rules in China's Electricity Act, enacted in 1996, are hindering the integration of renewable energy into the country's power grid. As a result, in 2010, only about 70% of the installed wind power generating capacity and slightly under 60% of installed solar power generating capacity are on-grid. So the renewable sector still has integrational hurdles to overcome. Emissions reduction in China. China has been implementing a national policy of energy conservation and emission reduction since 2006. During 2005 to 2009, over 50 gigawatts of small and energy inefficient electricity generating units were shut down, and all newly built units were large and comparatively energy efficient. These included coal-fired power generation, cement production, and iron and steel production. Thus, China has avoided about 1.6 billion tons of CO2 emissions through energy intensity reduction during its 11th five-year plan. These emission reduction controls were reflected positively in decreased carbon emissions relative to generation or processing in various high-emission sectors. 13. China and the CDM. Overseen by the United Nations, the CDM allows companies and industrialized nations to sponsor greenhouse gas emissions reducing projects in developing countries. As a result, the sponsor offsets emissions with a lower cost, while the host country obtains cash from implementing low-carbon technologies. China has quickly become the dominant CDM carbon credit supplier. By July 2011, China had approved 3,154 CDM projects, mainly focusing on new and renewable energy, energy conservation, and the enhancement of energy efficiency, methane recycling, and reutilization, and other areas. A total of 1,560 Chinese projects have been successfully registered with the CDM Executive Board, accounting for nearly half of the world's total registered projects, and the resulting has reached an annual issuance volume of 328 million tons of CO2 emissions, accounting for 64% of the global total. 14. China and the CDM shortcomings. However good these statistics might look, and however beneficial they might be, there are some shortcomings to the CDM, specifically for China itself. Buyers are almost exclusively from outside of China, and thus it does not encourage competition within sectors or between regions in China to find low-cost ways to reduce carbon intensity and increase energy efficiency. Secondly, the CDM means much less for China in terms of actual emissions reductions. Also, uncertainty over the future of the CDM is an increasing concern and consequent driver for China to develop its own standalone domestic trading system, while at the same time staking out its position in a global trading system. Lastly, envisioning the growing importance of the global carbon market, many in China now argue that, in the long run, being able to participate adeptly in international trading will be more profitable than selling CERs at very low prices under the CDM. China's CDM Fund is currently working with its partners to determine which sectors are best to be included in a carbon trading system. The CDM Fund, managed by the Ministry of Finance, is also providing grants to different regional pilots. Globally, there are about 3,000 registered CDM projects, and it is estimated that from its inception to 2012, the entire CDM will have reduced global carbon emissions by about 1 billion tons of CO2. Meanwhile, with a 10% annual growth, China's CO2 emissions reached 8.95 billion tons in 2010. This means the one-year increase from 2009 to 2010 in China is close to the entire reduction through CDM globally over the 8 years. Carbon trading pilot schemes. China has recently begun to consider carbon trading as a carbon mitigation program. Some benefits of carbon trading for China would be that it opens up trading to local Chinese firms, opens China up to proper verification and monitoring systems, is an alternative to direct administration and arguably the best way to open up to a low-carbon economy, and helps avoid power cuts to local firms to meet efficiency targets, such as what happened in Hebei in 2010. China has mostly relied on administrative tools to realize its 20% energy intensity reduction target between 2006 and 2010. China and carbon trading. China officially launched carbon trading in 2011 to help it meet its 2020 carbon intensity target. According to the country's National Development and Reform Commission, it was agreed to start trading during its 12th five-year plan period. In November 2011, the NDRC ordered 7 Chinese cities and provinces to set up pilot carbon trading systems during the 12th five-year plan, including Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Chongqing, Shenzhen, the 5 cities, and Guangdong and Hubei provinces. After the provinces submit their implementation plans at the end of 2012, the goal is to have pilot carbon trading at the regional level by 2014 and at a national level by 2016. During the pilot phase, local governments can decide upon the means of capping and select capped sectors themselves. However, the NDRC said, as a developing country, China does not shoulder legally binding responsibilities to reduce carbon emissions according to the basic principles set by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as the UNFCCC. The country's first voluntary carbon trade was sealed in August 2010 with a Shanghai-based auto insurance company buying more than 8,000 tons of carbon credits generated through a green commuting campaign during the Beijing Olympics. The trade was carried out through the China-Beijing Environment Exchange. The 7 regional pilots were selected to reflect the regional diversity in terms of development. Many of them are also part of the low-carbon development pilots initiated in August 2010. All piloting are required to submit proposals explaining how carbon emission targets will be allocated, establish a dedicated fund to support the carbon trade market, and present a detailed implementation plan for approval by the State Council by the end of 2012. During the 12th five-year plan, it is also highly probable that China will initiate environmental carbon taxation, either for pilot testing or to be adopted nationally. While this is feasible, it is unclear how taxes will be integrated and coordinated with the carbon trading market. China and carbon trading continued. Some recent developments in carbon trading are: in September, Guangdong Province released details of its carbon trading scheme. 827 enterprises and 9 industries, which together account for over half of the province's power consumption, will take part. Companies that emit more than 20,000 tons of CO2 per year are required to participate. Next year, Shenzhen City will launch an emissions trading scheme with 800 enterprises from 26 industries that exceed 20,000 tons per year, accounting for over 54% of the city's carbon emissions. Also in September, the European Union declared that it will work with China to cut greenhouse gas emissions via projects including China's carbon trading scheme. The European Union will contribute 25 million euros and technical assistance over a 4-year period to three carbon reduction projects. Apart from helping with the design and implementation of emissions trading schemes in China, the other projects are to assist Chinese cities to be resource efficient and to cut water and heavy metal pollution and implement sustainable waste treatment policies. Industry or area. The pilot provinces and cities that will take on and test various modes of trade are currently at different stages of development and are opting for different implementation paths. For example, Guangdong Province aims to design China's first regional carbon market with trading in key sectors, emphasizing heavily methods drawn from the EU ETS model. Sectors are also being considered for possible trading implementation, such as coal-fired power generation. The power sector has piloted several important projects. 2 of the top 5 power companies, Datang and Guodian, have started piloting greenhouse gas emissions measurement and reporting in preparation for future trading. In 2010, China implemented intergrid trading among regional grid companies to save energy. This program adjusts the distribution and usage of electricity across regions. However, there currently is no consensus on whether an emissions cap should be absolute or intensity-based. Challenges. The success or failure of domestic carbon trading in China under the 12th Five-Year Plan will to a large extent determine the future, or at least the near future, of carbon markets development in China, and will have a great impact on the potential for China to meet defined carbon and energy intensity goals and the global effort of climate mitigation. Although several cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin started testing voluntary carbon trading 2 years ago, the infrastructure in China is virtually non-existent. China still lacks essential legislation such as trading rules, monitoring, enforcement, and punishment for non-compliance, third-party verifications to support domestic carbon trading, accurate emission measurement, administrative capacity, such as cross-level and cross-sectoral coordination. The aforementioned CDM Fund, as well as the Tianjin Climate Exchange, one of China's 3 major voluntary environmental exchanges, is working with the Asian Development Bank to tailor a carbon trading platform. The EU has also recently announced its development support. In conclusion, developments in carbon reduction, clean technology, and their implementation over the 12th Five-Year Plan are of stark importance not only to China but to the world. Not only to China as the second largest economy, but now as the largest emitter of fossil fuel-related emissions. China has taken large steps to curb its carbon emissions. For example, the annual industrial output of the energy-saving, environmental protection, and recycling sectors is expected to reach 4.6 trillion yuan between 2011 and 2015. However, there are logistical and ideological challenges that China must contend with, such as its economic drive and its current lack of legal and administrative oversight for environmental projects. Thank you.